In the late 1930s, the city of Lwów, modern-day Lviv, stood at a cultural and intellectual crossroads. Its patched streets carried the languages of empire: Polish, Ukrainian, Yiddish, and German. Its hospitals, clinics, and lecture halls reflected that same mixture. At the heart of it all, medicine thrived. Professors in white coats moved between the halls of the Jan Kazimierz University and the newly built municipal hospital, teaching the next generation of doctors in a city that still believed in progress. Medicine in interwar Lwów was a badge of prestige. The Faculty of Medicine, founded in the 18th century, had weathered partitions and wars, emerging as one of Eastern Europe's most respected institutions. Within its classrooms, anatomy models sat beside microscopes, and students debated the latest research from Vienna and Krakow. It was a city of ambition, where being a doctor meant more than skill. It meant belonging to a professional world that transcended politics. Yet, beneath that surface of order, the ground was shifting. The late 1930s were uneasy years. The city's physicians, like its residents, were divided by ethnicity and language. The Ukrainian Medical Society, founded in 1910, operated in parallel to the Polish medical community. Jewish doctors, barred from some institutions, worked in separate clinics or private practices. Each group maintained its own journals, associations, and hospitals, professional partitions, mirroring the city's fragile social fabric. Lwow's medicine was modern, but its unity was brittle. Still, innovation flourished. In a modest building on Nicholas Street, Professor Rudolf Weigl led his team at the Institute for Typhus and Virus Research, using human louse feeders, volunteers who allowed lice to feed on their blood. Weigl's team cultivated a vaccine that could prevent the deadly epidemic sweeping parts of Europe. The institute became a beacon of science and an unlikely bridge between divided communities: Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews working side by side in pursuit of knowledge. In quieter moments, Weigl's assistants joked that the louse had become Lwow's most democratic citizen. Hospitals across the city reflected both progress and strain. The General Hospital on Wychakov Street admitted hundreds daily. Specialized wards treated tuberculosis, venereal diseases, and the chronic effects of poverty. The city maintained 8 hospitals by 1939, supplemented by charity wards and private clinics. Doctors often moved between them, teaching in the morning, operating in the afternoon, and making home calls well into the night. Despite limited resources, they prided themselves on keeping standards close to those of Western Europe. But the world beyond the wards was changing faster than medicine could adapt. Rumors of war drifted eastward with the summer air of 1939. Patients whispered of troop movements and alliances. Professors speculated in cafes about what might come next. Yet within the hospitals, the daily routines continued: lectures on pathology, new batches of medical graduates, the sterile smell of disinfectant lingering in the corridors. For many doctors, the tension was personal. Lwow's medical community had survived the Great War and the Polish-Ukrainian conflict of 1918–19, but few believed another catastrophe could be so near. Older physicians carried memories of cholera and battlefield amputations. They had rebuilt their wards once already. Younger ones, ambitious, fluent in German and Latin, dreamed of publishing research abroad, not treating shell wounds. There was pride in the city's hospitals, but also arrogance. Even as military drills began in nearby fields, the university's administrators planned expansions, not evacuations. A shipment of surgical tools ordered from Berlin arrived that spring. Ironically, one of the first last before borders closed. Nurses sewed extra linens, but few imagined they would soon serve as makeshift bandages. By early September 1939, the tension had become impossible to ignore. Refugees from Western Poland began to appear at the train station, their faces drawn, carrying stories of bombings and overcrowded field hospitals. Within days, the city's physicians realized the front was moving toward them. Ambulance trains were demanded for soldiers, leaving civilians stranded. The smell of smoke from distant fires began to mix with the antiseptic of hospital corridors. The staff at the university clinic, once absorbed in academic life, now faced an unrelenting stream of casualties. There was no clear chain of command, only improvisation. Classrooms became wards. Operating theatres never closed. Professors who once lectured on theory now performed status by candlelight. They treated soldiers, civilians, and even enemy prisoners, often side by side. In the chaos, a quiet code of duty held them together. A doctor treats whoever lies before him, one physician reportedly told a nurse as the first wave of wounded arrived. It was a fragile creed, but it would define Lwow's medical community through the years of occupation to come. Among those working tirelessly was Marian Panchishin, a respected Ukrainian physician and dean of the medical faculty. He had spent years navigating the politics of identity within the university, advocating for Ukrainian language instruction while maintaining professional ties with Polish colleagues. For him, as for many, the invasion forced an impossible balance between loyalty to the nation and service to humanity. The night skies over Lviv soon turned red. German bombs struck railway lines and the industrial district. Fires spread toward the city centre. Hospitals filled faster than anyone could count. The telephone lines failed, and messages were carried by bicycle or on foot. The ambulance trains could not move, the tracks were hit, and the locomotives were destroyed. Students and nurses dragged stretchers through streets littered with glass. As the first patients overflowed into nearby schools and churches, the doctors of Lwów confronted the reality that their city was now a front line. Supplies reduced, sterilizers broke, food was rationed. Still, they worked. They tied improvised tourniquets, reused bandages, and sterilized instruments over open flames. Amid the screams and smoke, the ideals of the old medical world, research, lectures, academic rank, seemed to fade into irrelevance. And yet, amid the destruction, the spirit of duty endured. The physicians who had once competed for publication and prestige now shared tools, space, and risk. They were not soldiers, but they were under siege all the same. By the end of September, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Soviet troops advanced from the east, German forces closed from the west. The city would soon change hands again, its flags, its rulers, and its rules. For Lvov's physicians, the nightmare was only beginning. But in those final days before the Soviet entry, as bombs fell around the hospital courtyards and the wounded filled every corridor, something intangible held: the oath, the instinct, the shared sense of duty. Even as the world outside fractured, the doctors of Lwów kept their lamps burning through the night, unaware that the next occupation would test them far more than the war itself. The sirens faded by morning, leaving a silence more haunting than the noise. Lwów had fallen, but its hospitals still stood scarred, half-ruined, yet alive. The city's healers would face new masters, new orders, and new moral trials. What they could not know was that medicine itself would become a battlefield. The ambulance trains never came. Tracks west of the city lay twisted and scorched, and by the second week of September 1939, the corridors of Lwow's hospitals were lined with stretchers pushed so close that nurses stepped sideways to pass. Classrooms at the university clinic were converted into wards. 2 nearby schools opened as emergency shelters, with rows of cots under chalkboards, where yesterday's lectures still lingered in dust. In those first days, doctors learned to improvise faster than they could write orders. The General Hospital on Wojciechów Street absorbed the overflow from municipal clinics, while charity wards took in the elderly and the poor. 8 hospitals served a city now on a front line, and their staffs rotated without sleep, morning rounds shaded into night triage, and home calls all but ceased. Rumours moved faster than stretchers. German artillery to the west, columns of refugees to the east. And then, suddenly, Soviet units entering from the direction of Zamarstynov. The shift of power was as swift as it was baffling. After days of bombardment and a negotiated surrender, the red banners appeared over municipal buildings. Soviet administrators arrived with ledgers and seals, and within weeks, the vocabulary of Lwow's medicine began to change. University letterheads bore new names in Cyrillic. Committees replaced faculties. A People's Health Department was declared responsible for everything from immunization quotas to hospital budgets. The city's physicians understood immediately. Medicine would continue, but under a different doctrine and a different gaze. At Jan Kazimierz University, the Faculty of Medicine, older than most of the city's streets by more than a century, was reorganized. Professors whose lectures had opened with quotations from Vienna now signed attendance lists in Russian. Departments were merged, syllabi rewritten, and posts re-advertised with ideological prerequisites. Some doctors, especially those fluent in Russian or Ukrainian, found room to continue. Others, denounced for bourgeois sympathies or for ties to Prussian pre-war institutions, were dismissed. A few simply did not return after a knock at night. The changes filtered down to the wards. Procurement orders now ran through Soviet channels. Allocations were precise on paper and uncertain in practice. Ether and disinfectant arrived late or not at all. X-ray tubes were demanded for military depots. A new form required weekly reporting of socially significant diseases, which included not only typhus and tuberculosis but also injuries from accidents in newly nationalized workshops. The data mattered. Statistics were proof of governance, and doctors learned to count as carefully as they sewed. Yet amid ideology, the medicine itself did not pause. Winter brought cramped apartments and coal shortages, the perfect conditions for louse-borne disease. Typhus had long haunted Galicia, and the spectre returned each time transport faltered or refugees crowded into unheated rooms. In a low, nondescript building, Professor Rudolf Weigl's Institute for Typhus and Virus Research kept working. The method was as improbable as it was effective. Human feeders offered their forearms to boxes of lice, sustaining colonies from which vaccine material could be harvested. Under the new rulers, the institute persisted, perhaps because epidemics recognized no politics, perhaps because a working vaccine was an asset to any state. Hospitals learned to anticipate shortages. Cotton was unpicked and re-rolled. Glass vials were washed and reused until their markings faded. Surgeons postponed elective cases and converted theaters for emergency procedures. Between shifts, nurses mended gowns and inventoried soap. Some of the city's most accomplished clinicians now spent hours negotiating for coal with depot clerks or arguing over delivery schedules with rail officials who had never seen an operating room. The professional map of the city changed with the regime. Jewish physicians, already alert to rising danger before the war, navigated a new and contradictory landscape harsh in politics, yet not yet murderous, and complicated by policy that varied between inclusion and suspicion. Polish doctors who had held senior positions found themselves sidelined or monitored. Ukrainian practitioners, sometimes advanced, sometimes collided with the same bureaucracy they thought might favor them. Medicine remained a calling, but it had become a ledger of identities, loyalties, and survival strategies. Behind the reception desks and beneath the new posters praising sanitation and labor, there was also fear. The initials NKVD were spoken softly. Lists circulated of colleagues questioned or removed. A lecturer in pathology failed to appear for his seminar. He had, it was said, traveled east. Another doctor, outspoken in staff meetings, learned to measure his words. In the wards, the ethic remained unchanged. Whoever arrived on a stretcher was treated. But beyond the doors, the definitions of duty and safety grew more complicated with each month. Not everything darkened. Vaccination campaigns, planned with the blunt instruments of a command economy, reached neighborhoods that had long been underserved. Infant clinics received scales and sterilizers stamped with Soviet emblems. Public health lectures, ideological slogans attached still conveyed useful instructions about lice control and boiling water. Some administrators meant it when they spoke of building a new, rational system. Doctors learned to take what helped and to endure what did not. The city's medical teachers carried on. Anatomy practicals resumed, now with revised curricula and an emphasis on practical necessity. Students in white coats moved between dissecting rooms and fever wards, their notebooks annotated in 2 alphabets. A few faculty members discovered they could protect junior colleagues by assigning them to research projects at Weigl's Institute or by documenting indispensable posts on the typhus wards. Bureaucracy could destroy, but it could also shelter when carefully navigated. By spring 1941, Lwow's hospitals had achieved a strange equilibrium. The ambulance trains still rarely ran on time, but the wards were calmer than during the bombardments. Epidemics flashed and were contained. Budgets were tight, but the ledger balanced enough to keep lights on and sterilizers humming. Doctors had learned the new signatures, the new forms, and the new risks. The city lived by adjustments, yet the maps on the walls told a harder truth. War had not reduced. It had only moved. Rumors arrived with travelers from the east. Troop concentrations, orders to stockpile gauze and saline, whispers that the summer would bring another change none could control. In administrative offices, officials denied the talk. In storerooms, head nurses quietly counted bandages and set aside iodine. On the longest days of June, the evening light lingered over the courtyards of Lwow's hospitals. Windows were open for air, and the wards smelled faintly of carbolic. A senior surgeon walked the corridor, pausing to listen to the soft hiss of an ether mask, the steady tick of a wall clock. He noted the supplies on the shelf and the night duty log. It was routine, hard-won, fragile, and precious. At dawn on 22 June 1941, the routine was shattered. The first distant explosions rolled over the city like a storm breaking beyond the horizon. Within minutes, the telephones were ringing again, the old signal that everything was changing. Nurses lifted the emergency kits they had kept ready since winter. Orderlies pulled cots into rows beneath the lecture diagrams. Doctors reached for their coats, not knowing whether the forms they had learned to navigate would matter at all by noon. The wards of Lwow would fill again, and this time, the occupation to come would demand choices no training had prepared them to make. Dawn on June 22, 1941, came with the sound of artillery. At first, many in Lwów mistook it for thunder rolling across the Carpathians. Then the windows shook, and the tremors did not stop. The eastern sky pulsed red, one more sunrise of war, in a city that had already changed hands once. Within hours, the streets filled with smoke, the air raid sirens wailed, and the hospitals that had just begun to rebuild after 1939 once again became battlefronts. In the operating theatres of the General Hospital, the doctors already knew the rhythm. Triage, morphine, suture, and move on. But this time, the uniforms were Soviet. Retreating soldiers poured through the city. Many wounded, others frantic to escape. Medical teams treated what they could: shrapnel wounds, burns, trauma, but there were too many. Corridors clogged with stretchers. Supplies dwindled. The ambulance stations were overrun. No one could say who commanded the city or how long it would hold. The chaos deepened when Soviet NKVD units began clearing their prisons. As German forces neared, the secret police executed prisoners in cellars across Lwow. When the Red Army withdrew and Wehrmacht troops entered days later, locals discovered the bodies hundreds, perhaps thousands. Shock and vengeance mingled in the streets. For the city's doctors, it meant another wave of horror. Identifying corpses, tending to survivors, and watching mobs form outside their gates. The German occupation began with the illusion of liberation for some and fear for others. Wehrmacht columns entered to cheering from a few, silence from most. But by July 4, any hopes of stability had vanished. On that day, in an operation that remains one of the darkest in Lviv's history. German forces, assisted by local collaborators, rounded up and murdered dozens of university professors. Among them were physicians and scientists. Antoni Szczerzinski, a renowned stomatologist and academic, was shot along with his family. Other faculty of the medical department vanished into ditches on the outskirts. The massacre sent a clear signal: intellect itself was a threat. Survival now depended on adaptation. The Nazi regime seized hospitals, assigning them to military command. German administrators replaced Soviet ones, and the red banners came down, replaced by swastikas. Yet for doctors, uniforms mattered less than orders. Treat, obey, and remain silent. The hospitals continued to function, but the rules changed. Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews worked in the same corridors, but hierarchy was enforced by race and policy. Among the surviving medical institutions, one became both refuge and paradox. Rudolf Weigl's Institute for Typhus and Virus Research. The same louse-borne disease that had terrified armies now offered a means of resistance. The Germans valued Weigl's vaccine program for their own troops. To maintain production, Weigl recruited assistants, technicians, and louse feeders, men and women who allowed lice infected with weakened typhus strains to feed on their blood in exchange for food, pay, or simply protection. It was degrading, tiresome work, but a lifeline. Weigl quietly used his institute to shelter those marked for persecution. Polish intellectuals, Jewish doctors, and students found employment there. Their names entered on official lists that gave them temporary immunity from deportation. Feeding lice became an act of quiet defiance. Science used to save lives under the eyes of occupation. Years later, survivors would remember that small building as a strange island of safety in a drowning city. But most physicians had no such shield. In April 1942, the occupation authorities ordered the registration of all Jewish medical professionals. Each received a stamped form marked Jude. For some, it was a death sentence deferred. They were ordered to work in isolated clinics within the ghetto, stripped of hospital privileges, their instruments and books confiscated. They still treated the sick, malnutrition, typhus, frostbite, but without supplies, without anesthetics, and always under threat of the next roundup. A Jewish pediatrician later wrote that she learned to treat without expecting survival, to keep a fevered child alive one more night, not because we thought it would matter, but because it was the only thing left that did. Such testimonies never made it into official records, but lived in memory, told in whispers long after the war. Outside the ghetto, the remaining Polish and Ukrainian physicians faced a subtler form of control. They were ordered to join occupational medical boards, to submit reports on disease rates, and to prioritize care for German personnel. Every form, every requisition carried risk. A missing signature could mean arrest for sabotage. Doctors learned to feign compliance, using paperwork as camouflage. A misreported statistic could hide a smuggled vial of vaccine or an unsanctioned treatment. Medicine became a language of quiet resistance, its ethics stretched to the breaking point. The moral strain was constant. Some physicians collaborated, seeking favor or safety. Others resisted in silence, using hospital stores to treat partisans in secret. There were no clean choices, only degrees of compromise. In one ward, a German supervisor demanded that all non-Aryan patients be discharged. The Polish head nurse simply hid the forms and delayed compliance until the list was forgotten. Small acts of disobedience became the only form of courage left. By late 1942, the hospitals themselves were buckling under pressure. Resources flowed to the front, not to civilians. Beds disappeared from military units. Quotas for German patients rose. The doctors who had once been scholars became bureaucrats and survivalists. In the hospital basements, they kept notebooks of the dead, quiet, factual, without judgment, because to forget was worse than to remember. As the year turned, rumors spread of deportations beyond the ghetto, of trains leaving for destinations no one returned from. Few dared speak the names of those places. The doctors who had once measured disease in milliliters and grams now measured danger in glances and silences. And still, the work continued. A typhus outbreak swept through the poorer districts that winter, threatening to spread to German troops. The occupation authorities demanded emergency vaccinations, suddenly valuing the same doctors they had stripped of rights months before. It was a cruel balance, those marked for death now tasked with protecting their oppressors from disease. By year's end, exhaustion had replaced hope. Weigl's institute carried on, an anomaly within the machinery of occupation. His staff risked everything to maintain its dual existence, part laboratory, part sanctuary. The rest of Lviv's doctors faced the unrelenting grind of scarcity and fear. They were treated without drugs, amputated without anesthesia, and documented without certainty. In their notebooks, the word normal disappeared. Hospitals became replicas of the city itself, fractured, occupied, and holding on by instinct alone. And as 1942 drew to a close, the first heavy snows settled over Lviv's rooftops, hushing the streets that had known too many footsteps of soldiers. The doctors who remained still climbed the icy stairs each morning, their coats worn out, their hearts divided between duty and despair. They could not yet know that the next year would bring an epidemic, another purge, and the slow unraveling of the medical world they had once believed unbreakable. The winter of 1942 gave no salvation. Snow sealed the city in silence, and the hospitals of Lviv became islands of exhaustion rooms, where the smell of disinfectant mingled with smoke from makeshift stoves, and where the oath to heal collided daily with the commands of the occupiers. Typhus had returned with vengeance. It crept through tenements, barracks, and the ghetto alike, carried by lice and despair. For physicians, the war's third winter was not just another season of occupation, it was a war within the wards themselves. The lines between doctor and patient blurred. Everyone was hungry. Everyone was afraid. The Nazi authorities saw disease as a security threat, not a human one. Orders came to seal off infected neighborhoods and to isolate the sick by all means necessary. To the men in charge, typhus was a Jewish disease, a pretext for persecution disguised as sanitation. Yet within that cruelty, doctors still tried to practice medicine. At the Typhus Institute on Nicholas Street, Professor Rudolf Weigl's team worked day and night, producing vaccine batches, carefully nurturing lice colonies, harvesting intestines, distilling fluids, testing serums. The method was grotesque and ingenious, born from necessity. Human feeders, strapped with boxes of infected lice, sustained the insects on their own blood. It was work both dangerous and degrading, but those who took part gained a rare protection. Employment in the institute required an identification card stamped with German authorization. For hundreds, it was life itself. Weigl knew what that meant. Quietly, he expanded his staff lists. Former university students, dismissed professors, and Jewish doctors with forged papers appeared on his payroll. They became assistants, technicians, or simply feeders. Officially, they helped with the vaccine. Unofficially, they were being saved. To the Germans, it was science. To Lviv's persecuted intellectuals, it was a shelter disguised as research. Elsewhere, the picture was more dejected. In the ghetto, medical life shrank to survival. Jewish physicians, once respected in the city's leading hospitals, now worked in overcrowded infirmaries with no anesthesia, no antibiotics, and almost no food. They reused bandages until they disintegrated, boiled scalpels over tin cans, and recorded cases, knowing that most would not live to be discharged. Still, they documented everything: temperatures, symptoms, death counts, as though precision itself could defy oblivion. Outside the ghetto walls, colleagues in Polish and Ukrainian hospitals faced moral crises of their own. The German administration demanded reports on every case of typhus, every death, every movement of medical supplies. Physicians who underreported infections risked punishment. Those who told the truth risked deportation for endangering the army. In response, many learned to balance the ledger to write what would protect their patients rather than what was strictly true. A quiet conspiracy emerged across the city's wards. Vaccine doses, lost in transport, found their way to underground clinics. Typhus cases were reclassified as fevers of unknown origin. Jewish patients hiding under false identities were admitted under the names of deceased laborers. Medical records became instruments of resistance, the ink as potent a weapon as any rifle, but resistance had its limits. Food shortages deepened, black markets thrived, and epidemics spread faster than vaccines could be made. When the German health inspectors arrived, accompanied by armed police, they carried lists, not sympathy. Whole hospital wings could be sealed with a signature. Once, a physician was shot in a corridor for refusing to evacuate a fever ward fast enough. His nurses finished the rounds in silence. In the midst of that terror, the idea of ethics became both fragile and absolute. "We are not gods," one doctor wrote in his diary, "but to the dying we must pretend to be." Each decision carried weight. A vial, used for one patient, meant none for another. A forged certificate might save a colleague, but doom a stranger. Every life saved seemed to demand expect another lost. For the city's surviving doctors, collaboration was a word with no simple meaning. Some cooperated with the authorities to secure supplies or to protect staff. Others joined underground resistance cells, passing medical information to partisans in the forests. Many simply endured, caught between conscience and necessity. The hospitals became crossroads where humanity flickered beneath the machinery of occupation. Among the most remarkable episodes of that period were the efforts to preserve medical education itself, despite the occupation. Informal classes continued in basements and storerooms. Senior physicians lectured to a handful of students by candlelight, using structure sketches drawn from memory. No degrees were issued, but the knowledge survived. It was an act of defiance as quiet as Weigl's lab, a refusal to let science die under tyranny. By 1943, the city was brittle with exhaustion. Air raids increased. Rations shrank. The ghetto was liquidated in stages, and the number of physicians in Lviv dropped sharply. Many vanished into deportation trains. Others were executed in the streets. Those who remained carried on with mechanical resolve. Each morning, they washed their hands, tied their aprons, and faced the next line of patients. That spring, typhus peaked again. Whole families collapsed in the slums. The German health authority blamed racial hygiene failures and demanded stricter containment. To the doctors, it was an impossible command. Stop the epidemic with empty pharmacies. Improvised clinics sprang up in cellars, staffed by women and students, using saline brewed from boiled salt water. In the university hospital, patients shared beds. In the municipal wards, bodies were removed before dawn to keep morale intact. Amid this collapse, the physicians of Lviv clung to their last remaining principle: do no harm, even when harm was everywhere. They could not stop the war, but they could still treat a wound, ease a fever, whisper a prayer before a surgery. It was medicine reduced to its essence, the preservation of life in defiance of destruction. Yet the occupation's violence was turning inward. By late 1943, the terror would find the doctors themselves. Lists of unreliable professionals began circulating. Accusations of sabotage multiplied. Some of the city's best-known physicians disappeared overnight. Those who survived sensed the tide shifting again, not toward liberation, but toward another purge. Outside, artillery thunder echoed faintly from the east. The front was moving. In the wards, nurses exchanged glances and rumors: Soviet forces advancing, German units retreating, perhaps even an end to it all. But no one believed it yet. They had seen too much to hope easily. For now, Lviv's doctors did what they always had. They worked through the night, as bombs fell, as orders changed, as history closed in around them once more. They had kept the city alive through epidemics, starvation, and tyranny. But soon, the war would turn its full force upon them. The healers of Lviv were about to become its hunted. By the autumn of 1943, Lviv's hospitals were quieter than they had ever been, not from peace, but from absence. Many of the city's physicians were gone. Some had fled, others had been arrested, and too many had simply disappeared. The war that had consumed their patients now came for them. In those months, fear became a routine pulse through the wards. Every knock on a hospital door could mean an arrest. Every request for records might conceal an accusation. The killings began in whispers. A doctor was found shot near his apartment. Another was taken for questioning and never seen again. By September, the pattern was clear. The occupation authorities, increasingly paranoid and desperate, had turned on the very professionals who once kept their soldiers alive. At the center of this shadowed chapter stood the name that would come to symbolize Lviv's medical martyrdom, Marian Panchishin. Once the dean of the city's medical faculty, Panchishin had been a bridge between communities. A Ukrainian physician who had served both Polish and Ukrainian patients, and one of the few who believed medicine could transcend politics. During the occupation, he had tried to maintain a semblance of professional life, treating anyone who came through his door, but in a time when neutrality was viewed as disloyalty, his restraint made him a target. That September, reports spread of doctors being removed for political unreliability or suspected ties to the underground. Witnesses later recalled that Panchishin received anonymous warnings. He left his clinic, seeking refuge in St. George's Cathedral, the seat of the Greek Catholic Church. There, in the shadowed corridors of a sanctuary, a man who had once led medical lectures in crowded halls now prayed for his life. He would not live to see liberation. Sometime that month, he was found dead, murdered under circumstances never fully explained. Some accounts pointed to Nazi agents, others to nationalist extremists. No one was certain. What remained was the image of a physician slain in the same city, whose health he had once guarded. His death sent a chill through Lviv's medical community. In the weeks that followed, several more doctors vanished, Polish, Ukrainian, and Jewish survivors alike. The killings cut across every line of identity, as if to erase what remained of the profession itself. One surgeon was arrested for supposedly falsifying reports. A nurse who protested was shot on the hospital steps. The message was unmistakable. Knowledge, independence, and compassion were now acts of defiance. Inside the surviving hospitals, morale collapsed. Wards stood half empty, equipment dismantled for parts, records scattered. The younger doctors, the ones who had learned medicine by candlelight, now faced choices their mentors had not lived to make. A few joined underground partisan units, bringing with them their medical kits and fragments of surgical equipment. Others stayed, bound by patients who could not be moved. To leave meant abandoning the sick. To stay meant risking the same fate as Panchishin. Even in this darkness, small acts of conscience persisted. A Polish anaesthetist forged discharge papers for wounded resistance fighters. A Ukrainian nurse hid a fevered Jewish child in a laundry cart and wheeled her through the checkpoint. A laboratory assistant smuggled Weigl's vaccine samples to the countryside, where partisans fought typhus without proper supplies. None of these deeds was written down. The participants knew that paper could betray them. Their records existed only in memory, passed quietly from survivor to survivor. By early 1944, the front drew near again. German patrols grew harsher, their searches more random. Hospital stores were emptied for retreating troops. Generators were stripped from surgical theaters, leaving operations to be done by candlelight once more. The doctors who remained described the eerie quiet that fell each night. The distant rumble of artillery from the east, the creak of hospital doors, the steady tick of clocks that had outlasted everything else. Those who could not endure fled. Some walked east toward the Soviet lines, believing captivity might be safer than the Gestapo. Others sought refuge in monasteries or the countryside. Still others stayed simply because there was no one left to take their place. One wartime nurse would later recall that by the spring of 1944, the city had more ghosts than patients. When the first Soviet observation units reached Lviv's outskirts, they found hospitals barely functioning, wards filled with the untreated, operating tables covered in dust, and charts written in 3 languages by hands now gone. The staff who greeted them were gaunt, cautious, and silent. They had survived too many liberations to celebrate this one. But in the final weeks before that return, as German control collapsed and the last deportations began, one truth became clear to the survivors. The occupation had not only taken lives, it had dismantled an entire moral order. Medicine, which once meant neutrality and trust, had become a terrain of suspicion and control. Doctors had been made to choose between healing and obedience, between silence and defiance. And many had paid the ultimate price for choosing wrongly or simply for being who they were. In July 1944, when Soviet forces finally entered Lviv, the city's hospitals stood as ruins of both architecture and conscience. Equipment looted, archives burned, wards destroyed. But in the basements, among scattered instruments and blood-stained ledgers, there remained a fragile testimony. The names of patients treated, the lists of vaccine, feedings, the faint signatures of doctors who refused to stop writing even as the world around them fell apart. The siege of conscience was over, but the reckoning had only begun. Those who survived would now have to rebuild not only the walls of their hospitals, but the very meaning of medicine itself under yet another regime. The war was ending, but for Lviv's healers, the aftermath was only just beginning. When the guns finally fell silent over Lviv in July 1944, the city's surviving doctors stood amid ruins that were both physical and moral. Liberation had come again, but this time it wore the same red stars that many remembered from 1939. Soviet forces reclaimed Lviv on July 21, and once more, the hospitals were ordered to change their signs, their language, and their loyalties. The new rulers arrived with official praise for heroic medical workers of the liberated city. Yet few could mistake the tone beneath it. Inspections began within days. The People's Provisions for Health sent committees to assess readiness and to investigate wartime collaboration. The same surgeons who had risked their lives under the Germans were now questioned about their conduct, their contacts, even their patients. For many, the liberation felt like an interrogation with new uniforms. The hospitals themselves were barely functioning. The once proud university clinic had shattered windows and missing doors. The laboratory glassware was cracked or looted. The municipal hospital's roof had collapsed in one wing, and the wards were crowded with refugees, the wounded, and victims of starvation. Epidemics loomed again: typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis, driven by overcrowding and the collapse of sanitation. The doctors returned to the same old war they had never escaped, the war against disease. Amid the rubble, Professor Rudolf Weigl resumed his work. His Typhus and Virus Research Institute survived the occupation with its records intact, and Soviet officers, recognizing the strategic value of his vaccine, ordered the laboratory reopened. Once again, Weigl and his staff were pressed into service by the new regime, this time supplying vaccines for the Red Army. To the scientists, it felt like déjà vu. The same benches, the same pipettes, only the portraits on the wall had changed. Yet even that continuity could not disguise the losses. Dozens of Lviv's medical professors were gone, executed, exiled, or vanished in the chaos. The faculty lists were half empty. Lecture halls reopened to silence. Those who survived gathered in damaged classrooms to reassign duties and reopen wards. They lacked textbooks, reagents, and sometimes even paper, but they worked anyway. The impulse to heal had outlasted ideology. For younger physicians, the transition was cruelly familiar. The Soviet system reinstated its rigid hierarchies and ideological scrutiny. A new rector was appointed to the medical institute, tasked with reorganizing in accordance with socialist principles. Files were reviewed and backgrounds checked. Some doctors were denounced for bourgeois sympathies or national deviation. A few who had survived the Nazis were deported east as suspected collaborators. One survivor later recalled, "We learned to fear questions more than bullets." Still, the city's population needed care. Waves of displaced persons flooded Lviv. Polish families uprooted from the west, Ukrainian refugees from Volhynia, soldiers of both armies, and civilians caught between front lines. Hospital beds filled faster than they could be repaired. Supplies trickled in from Kiev and Moscow, but little reached the wards intact. Ether was replaced by alcohol, bandages by linen sheets torn into strips. The black market trade in medical goods thrived, and nurses became both healers and negotiators, bargaining for morphine or soap. Amid this scarcity, epidemics surged. In late 1944, typhus reappeared, carried by lice on refugees returning from camps. The same disease that had haunted the city for years now threatened its fragile recovery. Doctors organized quarantine zones and resumed vaccination drives, using whatever remained of Weigl's vaccine stocks. Once again, they stood between chaos and collapse, performing triage not on battlefields, but in the ruins of their own hospitals. For those who had survived the previous regimes, the sense of déjà vu was almost unbearable. They recognized the rhythms, slogans about reconstruction, official demands for efficiency, unspoken threats behind bureaucratic smiles. Yet this time, few dared to speak of what they had seen. The Nazi terror was a memory too dangerous to describe, the Soviet repression too near to provoke. Silence became another instrument of survival. Slowly, the structures of normalcy re-emerged. The Medical Institute reopened its programs, under a new name, Danilo Halitsky Lviv. Medical Institute, its curriculum rewritten, its archives purged. The oath of the physician remained, but its wording shifted. Devotion to the people replaced devotion to humanity, and allegiance to the state shadowed every clause. Yet behind those words, the doctors taught what they always had: how to listen to a heartbeat, how to set a bone, how to save a life. The moral exhaustion was harder to mend. Colleagues were missing, memories censored, graves unmarked. Some survivors searched for family members, finding only names on lists or traces in the margins of hospital ledgers. Others simply buried themselves in work, measuring recovery by statistics rather than sentiment. A new generation of medical students arrived, eager but unaware of the ghosts that haunted their lecture halls. The past was not erased, only unspoken. And yet, amid that silence, small moments of renewal appeared. In a ward rebuilt from bricks scavenged by hand, a young nurse began her first shift. The ward smelled of damp plaster and disinfectant. She adjusted a patient's bandage, unaware that the table she leaned on had once been used by doctors who risked their lives to keep the city alive. In another building, a returning professor delivered a lecture on anatomy, his voice steady, despite the gap where his colleagues should have sat. The students took notes by the light of an oil lamp, their faces thin but attentive. By the winter of 1944, the hospitals were running again, if only barely. Medicine in Lviv had survived bombardment, occupation, and betrayal, and now it learned to survive bureaucracy and fear. The city's healers had been tested by every force of war, ideology, hunger, epidemic, and somehow remained what they had always been, witnesses to human frailty and endurance. But as the city rebuilt under new banners, one question lingered in the wards and lecture halls alike. What would become of memory? The names of the murdered physicians were absent from official reports. The professors shot in 1941. The doctors killed in 1943. The Jewish healers erased from records, all vanished into the blank spaces of history. The survivors could not speak of them, but they could remember silently. Outside, snow began to fall again over Lviv, covering the scars of war. In the hospitals, the lamps burned low. The city's doctors worked through the night as they always had, quietly, methodically, and with the unspoken knowledge that healing was not only a duty, but an act of defiance. Their war had ended, but their conscience would never fully rest. The next battle would not be fought with bombs or rifles. It would be fought with memory, against the silence that followed liberation, and against the forgetting that history so often demands. The years after 1945 brought an uneasy peace to Lviv. Ended, but its shadows still haunted the wards and lecture halls. The city, now officially absorbed into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, was forced to reinvent its identity once again. The hospitals that had witnessed bombardment and occupation were rebuilt brick by brick. But the names on the plaques changed, and many of the people who once walked their corridors were gone forever. For Lviv's medical community, survival had come at a cost measured not only in lives, but in silence. The Soviet administration had little interest in monumentalizing the dead physicians of the occupation years, especially those who had been Polish, Jewish, or deemed politically unreliable. Archives were sealed, records rewritten, and the very memory of those doctors was folded into substitutes like victims of fascism or wartime disruptions. It was easier for the new authorities to rebuild the buildings than to face the stories buried beneath them. Still, memory persisted in quiet ways. In 1946, the Museum of Medicine History in Galicia, its exhibits rescued from storage and bombed classrooms, opened its doors once more. It displayed the instruments of surgery and obstetrics, the crude glass syringes, and a single louse-feeding box from Rudolf Weigl's laboratory. Visitors paused at it without words. The label made no mention of the hundreds saved through that work, or the quiet defiance it had embodied. But those who knew, knew. Professor Weigl himself did not remain in Lviv for long. By the late 1940s, the political climate grew dangerous for anyone associated with wartime institutions, even those who had resisted the occupiers. Accused by some of collaboration, honored by others for saving lives, he left for Poland. His institute was absorbed into the Soviet research network, stripped of his name. In the official version of history, the typhus vaccine became an achievement of collective Soviet science. The reconstruction of Lviv's hospitals was slower but steady. The Danilo Halitsky Medical Institute expanded, taking over what remained of the university's medical faculty. Young doctors trained under professors who carried invisible scars. The lectures were clinical, precise, and cautious. Words like occupation, purge, and massacre were never spoken aloud. Yet the students could sense them in the pauses, the small hesitations before certain dates, the glances exchanged when someone mentioned 1941 or 1943. For the next generation, the war existed only as rumor and inherited silence. The students memorized anatomy and chemistry, but few learned the names of Antoni Cierzyński or Marian Panchishin. Even Rudolf Weigl was mentioned sparingly, often reduced to a line in a textbook. Official memory had no room for divided loyalties or moral complexity. The doctors who had healed under two dictatorships were written out, replaced by redefined narratives of socialist progress. Yet the past could not be completely erased. Every so often, a former nurse or assistant would mention a missing colleague, or an elderly patient would recall the doctor who saved me during the typhus years. Their recollections floated like disorderly fragments, too personal for official history, too important to forget. The war had taught Lviv's healers a hard lesson, that sometimes remembrance itself was an act of resistance. By the 1960s, the city's hospitals had regained their rhythm. Modern wards opened, new instruments arrived, and research resumed. But behind the efficiency lay a deeper, quieter continuity, the moral inheritance of those who had once worked by candlelight and conscience alone. Even in a regime that demanded ideological conformity, many physicians retained the old principle of unbiased care. They remembered, in their own guarded ways, that medicine's first duty was not to power, but to humanity. Wasn't until decades later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and Ukraine's independence in 1991, that the veil began to lift. Archives reopened, names long erased resurfaced in university documents and church memorials. The massacre of Lviv's professors, once unspoken, was acknowledged publicly. The stories of the Jewish doctors who perished in the ghetto were researched again, their photographs displayed in the newly independent city's museums, and the name of Rudolf Weigl returned to its rightful place in the history of medicine, honored for saving thousands from both typhus and persecution. Today, visitors to Lviv can still find traces of that era if they look closely. The Museum of Medicine History holds instruments from the interwar hospitals and letters from Weigl's Institute. A quiet plaque at St. George's Cathedral recalls Marian Panchashin. The university itself, now the Danilo Halitsky Lviv National Medical University, bears witness to 2 centuries of intertwined science and suffering. The legacy of Lviv's physicians is not one of heroism in the grand sense, but of endurance. They faced the moral breakdown of occupation, the misuse of their discipline, and the impossible demand to serve life under systems built on death. Many failed, some compromised, and others quietly held their ground. But together, they left behind a record of how even in an age of destruction, the instinct to heal could not be extinguished. Their story reminds us that wars are not only fought on battlefields, they are also fought in wards, in laboratories, and within the human conscience. The doctors of Lviv carried that struggle through bombardment, through purges, through silence, and in the end, their endurance gave the city something the bombs could not destroy: a memory of decency in indecent times. In the corridors of Lviv's hospitals today, the lamps burn bright again. Students hurry through the same halls once lined with stretchers, their laughter echoing against walls rebuilt many times over. Few of them know the full history of the place they walk through, but somewhere, beneath the layers of paint and time, the spirit of those wartime physicians lingers, a quiet reminder that the duty to heal and to remember endures long after the war is over. So when the lights go out in the wards at night, and only the hum of machines remains, it is easy to imagine that faint, unseen presence, the legacy of Lviv's physicians under siege, who once worked through blackouts and fear, holding a single truth that outlasted every regime, that to save one life, even when the world has lost its humanity, is to keep humanity alive.